In every nation's history, there are chapters written in bold ink and others quietly erased. Ours is no exception. There are events so extraordinary, so revealing, that if widely known, they would challenge the stories we've been taught about who we are and how we got here. These aren't legends or theories whispered on the margins of society. They're documented truths, once hidden in sealed archives, buried beneath headlines, or censored from textbooks. And they demand our attention. This is a journey through time, not just through events, but through silence, through the stories that were deliberately left out. From military generals standing against fascist plots, to cities turned to ash under government orders, to children deprived of breakfast in the name of national security. Each of these stories opens a window into the shadowed corners of American history. They remind us that truth is not a given. It must be sought, uncovered, and sometimes even fought for. Why were these events erased? Who benefited from the silence? And what does it say about the institutions we trust to preserve the truth? These questions linger at the heart of every chapter to come. This series isn't about sensationalism or blame. It's about understanding the full complexity of our past, the courage, the cruelty, the contradictions. It's about reclaiming the lost pages and honoring the people, both victims and whistleblowers, who were written out of the script. And so we begin not with a conclusion, but with a question. What happens when the most powerful nation in the world decides certain truths are too dangerous for its people to know? We'll start in the heart of the Great Depression, where a secret plot threatened the very core of American democracy and was almost forgotten forever. This is not a story of conspiracy. It's a story of power, control, and memory, of how history is curated and how easily it can be lost. This is the prologue to a series that invites you not just to learn, but to remember. Because what we remember shapes who we become, and what we forget defines what we're allowed to question. It was 1933, and America was on its knees. The Great Depression had hollowed out the nation. Bread lines stretched for blocks, banks collapsed overnight, and families huddled in makeshift shelters waiting for some flicker of hope. Franklin D. Roosevelt had just taken office, promising bold change through a sweeping agenda called the New Deal. But not everyone welcomed that change. In boardrooms far removed from the breadlines, a different kind of plan was forming. They were titans of industry, names etched into the steel and concrete of America's infrastructure. Bankers, chemical executives, and weapons manufacturers. Men whose wealth granted them influence, and whose influence had gone unchecked for decades. To them, Roosevelt wasn't a savior. He was a threat. His policies, they believed, would tip the balance away from their fortunes and toward working people. And so, they hatched a plot, not just to stop the New Deal, but to overturn the entire government. Their vision? A new regime in Washington, one built on the corporate model of Mussolini's fascist Italy. A tightly controlled economy managed by elites. Democracy stripped of its power. The plan was stunning in its boldness. Recruit 500,000 war veterans, led by a trusted military icon, and march on Washington to force Roosevelt from office. They chose their man carefully, Major General Smedley Butler, the most decorated Marine in U.S. history. He had fought in wars from the Philippines to France. Veterans loved him. They would follow him anywhere. And that was the conspirators' fatal miscalculation. Butler listened. He asked questions. And then, in a move that would alter history, he betrayed their trust, not to join their cause, but to stop it. He went directly to Congress, testifying in 1934 before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He named names. He provided evidence, documents, bank statements, even testimony from the very messenger sent to recruit him. The committee's report confirmed it. The plot was real. The goal was fascism, and America had narrowly escaped it. But then, silence. The media downplayed the story. many outlets controlled by the very men implicated. No arrests were made. No trials followed. The full report? Suppressed. And those powerful men? They returned to their offices, unpunished, their reputations intact. For decades, Butler's testimony was dismissed as exaggerated. Only in the 1970s, when long-hidden documents were unearthed, did the magnitude of the plot become undeniable. By then, most of the architects were long dead. Justice was no longer an option. Yet the story matters, not just for what happened, but for what nearly did. It reminds us that democracy is not invincible, that power, unchecked, can turn on the very nation that made it possible, and that the line between patriot and traitor can sometimes come down to a single man's decision. General Butler's courage didn't just stop a coup. It preserved a fragile democracy at a moment when the world was tilting toward authoritarianism. But his story, like so many others, was nearly lost. So we remember it here, not to stir fear, but to recognize how easily truth can be silenced, and how essential it is to keep listening for the echoes of stories that were almost never told. In the spring of 1962, the Cold War cast a long shadow over the United States. Tensions with Cuba were high, and fear of communism was as thick as the smog hanging over Washington. Inside the Pentagon, a secret proposal was taking shape, one that would never make headlines until decades later. Its name was Operation Northwoods, and its intent was chilling. What if the United States provoked its own war? What if, in order to justify an invasion of Cuba, the American military staged a series of false flag attacks on its own citizens? The plan, approved unanimously by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, detailed how fake terrorist events could be engineered to whip the nation into war fever. The methods read like a dystopian playbook: hijack commercial airplanes, bomb public places, kill civilians, and then blame Fidel Castro. One suggestion involved sinking a boat of Cuban refugees either for real or in a staged explosion to provoke international outrage. Another plan outlined the fake downing of a U.S. passenger jet filled with college students, supposedly shot by a Cuban MiG. The planners even wrote that publishing casualty lists in American newspapers would stir the public into action. These weren't vague ideas tossed around in back rooms. They were formal proposals, typed, signed, and delivered to the Secretary of Defense. Had they been approved by President Kennedy, history might have taken a very different turn. But Kennedy was horrified. He rejected the plan outright. Not long after, he began the process of removing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, one of the plan's chief architects. Operation Northwoods was buried, classified, and forgotten, that is, until 1997. A researcher obtained the original documents through the Freedom of Information Act. When they were made public, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. Here was undeniable proof that America's top military leadership had designed a blueprint for domestic terrorism to manipulate public opinion and justify war. For over 3 decades, the public had no idea. There were no whistleblowers, no press leaks. The plan remained sealed behind layers of classification. It's a sobering reminder of how easily the line between defense and deception can blur in the name of national interest. The significance of Operation Northwoods isn't just that it was proposed, it's that it was taken seriously at the highest levels of power. The machinery to deceive, to sacrifice innocent lives for geopolitical advantage was not only possible, it was prepared. In the end, what stopped it wasn't public outrage or media scrutiny, it was one man's moral refusal. A president who, despite his flaws, drew a line. But that raises a question we can't ignore. If this proposal stayed hidden for 35 years, how many others never surfaced? How many lines were crossed without resistance? Operation Northwoods is a case study in secrecy, loyalty, and what happens when trust is placed in institutions with unchecked authority. It didn't happen, but it could have. And that's why we remember it, not as a conspiracy theory, but as a documented fact. A warning written in official ink, buried in silence, and finally, reluctantly, revealed. Tulsa, Oklahoma. The name evokes images of wide plains, oil wealth, and Midwestern resilience. But in 1921, it became the site of one of the most violent racial massacres in American history. A story so devastating and so carefully erased that most people didn't hear about it for nearly a century. At the heart of Tulsa was a neighborhood called Greenwood. It was a thriving, self-sufficient black community known nationwide as Black Wall Street. Banks, hospitals, schools, theaters, grocery stores, all black-owned, all flourishing. At a time when segregation confined opportunities for African Americans, Greenwood was an exception, a beacon of success and autonomy. But success in a racist society is often seen as a threat. On May 31, 1921, an accusation was made. A young black man allegedly assaulted a white elevator operator. There was no evidence, no trial, just a headline and a lynch mob forming outside the courthouse. Black World War I veterans determined to protect the accused from vigilante justice arrived armed. A confrontation followed, shots were fired, and then the mob descended on Greenwood. What unfolded was not a riot. It was an organized attack. White mobs, some deputized by the city, looted and burned the district block by block. Reports surfaced of private planes flying overhead, dropping incendiary bombs, the first known aerial assault on American civilians. In just 24 hours, 35 square blocks were reduced to ash. Churches, schools, businesses, gone. As many as 300 people were killed. Thousands were left homeless. Survivors told stories of machine gun fire, bodies tossed into mass graves, and arrests. Not of the attackers, but of the victims. Black residents were rounded up and held in internment camps. Insurance companies denied claims. The city imposed laws making it nearly impossible for survivors to rebuild. And then came the silence. Local newspapers were scrubbed of references to the massacre. Police records vanished. Textbooks never mentioned it. The state of Oklahoma didn't formally acknowledge the massacre until the 1990s. It wasn't taught in schools until 2009. Why? Because acknowledging it meant confronting the truth, that this wasn't a spontaneous outbreak of violence, but a deliberate act of racial terror enabled by government complicity. In 1996, a state commission was finally formed to investigate. Ground-penetrating radar revealed mass graves. Eyewitness accounts were collected, but no reparations were issued. No one was ever held accountable. When the massacre was portrayed in a 2019 television series, many viewers assumed it was fictional. That's how deeply the truth had been buried. Greenwood's destruction was more than the loss of buildings. It was the erasure of a symbol, a place that proved black prosperity was not only possible, but thriving, a place that contradicted every racist narrative of the era. Remembering Tulsa is not just about honoring the dead. It's about recognizing how easily truth can be buried. It's about the cost of silence and the power of memory. When a society chooses to forget, it does more than hide the past. It distorts the present. And in that distortion, justice slips further from reach. Greenwood was real. Its destruction was deliberate, and for far too long, its story was left untold. It began with whispers and denials, buried deep within the shadows of the Cold War. By the time the truth emerged in the 1970s, it sounded more like a dystopian novel than a government program, yet it was real. For over 2 decades, the CIA conducted illegal mind control experiments on American citizens, without their consent, without their knowledge, and with devastating consequences. The project had a name, MK Ultra. From 1953 to 1973, it operated through over 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, and research labs. The goal was as ambitious as it was disturbing, to discover how to control the human mind. To do this, the CIA dosed unsuspecting people with LSD. They used sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, hypnosis, and even electroshock therapy at dangerous levels. Their subjects? Drug addicts, prisoners, psychiatric patients, sex workers, people considered disposable by a system that valued obedience over ethics. One of the most horrifying cases took place at a psychiatric hospital in Canada. Under CIA funding, a doctor subjected patients to psychic driving, playing recorded messages on loops for hours while patients were sedated, then wiping their memories with intense electroshock. Some patients forgot how to speak. Others forgot who they were. Families were destroyed, lives erased, and no one was told why. When Congress held hearings in 1975, the world got its first real glimpse into the program. But by then, the CIA director had already destroyed most of the records. The surviving documents, discovered by accident in a mislabeled box, revealed only a fraction of the program's scope. The official story says MK Ultra ended in 1973, but evidence suggests otherwise. Declassified files from the 1980s and 1990s show similar programs continuing under new names. One sub-project, known as Operation Midnight Climax, involved CIA agents operating fake brothels in San Francisco and New York, secretly drugging clients with LSD and observing their behavior through two-way mirrors. These experiments continued even after the supposed termination of MK Ultra. In 2010, a presidential bioethics commission confirmed that unethical human experimentation continued well into the 21st century. Soldiers were exposed to nerve gas and psychoactive drugs without informed consent. The methods had evolved. The secrecy remained. What makes MK Ultra so haunting isn't just the cruelty, it's the deliberate targeting of the vulnerable. The people society was least likely to believe, the ones least able to fight back. No one was ever prosecuted. No compensation was given. The victims, if they survived, were left with shattered lives and unanswered questions. The doctors and agents who carried out the experiments, many continued their careers without consequence. MK Ultra forces us to confront a painful truth, that in the pursuit of control, institutions will sometimes sacrifice morality, that the veil of national security can be used to justify the unthinkable. The story of MK Ultra isn't a cautionary tale from the past. It's a reminder of how easily ethics can be abandoned when no one is watching, and how many lives can be ruined in the name of secrets we were never supposed to know. There's a kind of violence that doesn't begin with weapons, but with fear. A violence not waged on battlefields, but in files, letters, and surveillance reports. Between 1956 and 1971, the FBI carried out an illegal domestic operation targeting citizens, not for crimes, but for speaking, organizing, and demanding change. It was called COINTELPRO. The stated goal was to protect national security. The real goal was to disrupt the civil rights movement, silence dissent, and dismantle grassroots activism. COINTELPRO targeted black leaders, anti-war protesters, Native American activists, women's rights advocates, and even journalists and clergy. If you questioned the government, you were a potential target. The program used wiretaps, forged letters, anonymous threats, and infiltration to spread paranoia and destroy trust within organizations. One of the most chilling tactics was psychological warfare. The FBI sent fake letters to civil rights leaders accusing them of betrayal. In some cases, these forged messages drove activists into depression or suicide. For one prominent leader, the Bureau went even further, recording his private moments and sending him a letter urging him to kill himself. The letter arrived just weeks before he was to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Against the Black Panther Party, the FBI's strategy was particularly brutal. Agents sowed false rumors to pit members against each other, encouraged violent confrontations, and passed along floor plans to police in advance of deadly raids. In one infamous case, the FBI facilitated a pre-dawn raid in Chicago, drugging a young leader before the officers stormed in and killed him in his sleep. The program didn't just monitor political movements, it actively worked to destroy them. Agents infiltrated meetings and encouraged illegal activity just to create grounds for arrest. In some cases, the only person advocating violence was the informant. The public didn't know about COINTELPRO until 1971, when a group of activists broke into an FBI office and stole classified documents. What they found was shocking: clear evidence of unconstitutional surveillance, psychological manipulation, and state-sponsored sabotage. Faced with irrefutable proof, the FBI acknowledged the program existed, but claimed it had been discontinued. Declassified documents from later decades suggest otherwise. The same tactics, surveillance, infiltration, disinformation, reappeared under different names and against new targets. After 9/11, similar strategies were used to infiltrate anti-war groups and environmental organizations. The justification changed. The playbook remained. No FBI agent was ever held accountable for COINTELPRO. Victims received no formal apology. Instead, the narrative shifted. Yes, mistakes were made, but only in the service of national security. Yet the documents reveal something else entirely: a systematic effort to suppress democracy by criminalizing dissent. COINTELPRO reminds us that power doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it hides behind badges, sealed warrants, and unmarked envelopes. It teaches us that civil liberties can be eroded quietly, in the name of stability. But most of all, it asks us to consider this: when those sworn to protect democracy become its saboteurs, who is left to hold them accountable? And how many voices were lost before the truth was finally dragged into the light? In the aftermath of World War II, the world swore it would never again allow medical atrocities in the name of science. The Nuremberg Code was born, an ethical line in the sand declaring informed consent sacred. But while America helped write those rules, it quietly broke them just months later. From 1946 to 1948, U.S. government researchers carried out medical experiments in Guatemala that defy belief. Nearly 1,500 people, prisoners, soldiers, orphans, and psychiatric patients, were deliberately infected with syphilis and gonorrhea without their knowledge or consent. Many would suffer lifelong consequences. Some would die. This was no rogue operation. It was approved, funded, and overseen by U.S. health agencies with full awareness at the highest levels. The goal was to study how sexually transmitted infections progressed and how treatments worked by watching real people get sick. Researchers began by paying infected sex workers to sleep with unsuspecting prisoners and soldiers. When that didn't produce quick enough results, they moved to direct inoculation, injecting bacteria into patients' bodies, even into open wounds. In one especially brutal case, researchers applied infected tissue directly to cuts they had made themselves. Psychiatric patients were the most vulnerable. They couldn't consent, they couldn't refuse, and so they were used. Many subjects were never treated for the diseases they were given. Records show at least 83 confirmed deaths, though the real toll is likely far higher. These were not treatments gone wrong. They were infections carried out as policy. For over 6 decades, the experiments remained a secret. Reports were buried. Data was published without mentioning how it had been obtained. Guatemala's government was never informed of the true nature of the program. The victims had no voice, no justice. Then, in 2005, an American professor stumbled upon archived files while researching another unethical study. What she found was overwhelming. Photographs, personal notes, and internal communications revealing a vast and intentional cover-up. Even after the discovery, it took 5 more years before the U.S. government acknowledged what had happened. In 2010, a formal apology was issued to Guatemala, but it came with no criminal charges, no reparations, just words. When survivors and families sought justice, they were denied. In 2015, a U.S. federal judge dismissed the case, citing sovereign immunity. The same government that admitted to violating human rights claimed it could not be held legally accountable. This episode isn't just a story about forgotten victims. It's about the fragility of ethics when power is unchecked. It's about how institutions meant to protect public health can become instruments of harm. And it raises hard questions. How many other files remain unopened? How many programs were hidden better than this one? What happens when a nation's scientific ambition outweighs its humanity? The Guatemalan experiments weren't an aberration. They were a reflection of a broader system willing to exploit the vulnerable in pursuit of knowledge and willing to keep those actions buried for generations. Remembering this history doesn't just honor the victims. It reminds us that true accountability requires more than apologies. It requires truth, transparency, and a commitment to never look away again. Some assassinations change history. Others reshape our understanding of how history is written. In 1968, a beloved civil rights leader was shot and killed on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. The official story was simple. A lone gunman with a criminal past fired a single fatal shot. Case closed. But the deeper you look, the more that story begins to fracture. In the decades since his death, a disturbing truth has emerged. This wasn't just a murder. It was a coordinated campaign rooted in fear, surveillance, and institutional silence. The FBI's obsession with this man began long before his assassination. Under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau viewed him as a threat to national stability. His influence, his voice, his vision for racial and economic justice, these things terrified the establishment. As he began to speak out not only about civil rights, but about the Vietnam War and poverty, the campaign against him escalated. FBI agents wiretapped his phones, bugged his hotel rooms, and mailed him blackmail letters, one of which encouraged him to take his own life. But even that wasn't the end. In 1999, more than 30 years after the assassination, a civil trial in Memphis brought the question of government involvement back into the spotlight. After 6 weeks of testimony and 70 witnesses, the jury came to a stunning conclusion. Government agencies were complicit in a conspiracy to assassinate him. One witness, a local restaurant owner, confessed that he had been paid $100,000 to help orchestrate the killing. Others described seeing military personnel and federal agents in the city days before the shooting. Even the family of the slain leader came to believe the official story was false. They met with the man convicted of the murder, who had always maintained his innocence, and publicly stated they believed he had been framed. The physical evidence didn't add up either. Ballistics tests were inconclusive. The alleged shooter's fingerprints were found on the rifle, but in a position inconsistent with having fired the weapon. Witnesses near the scene reported hearing gunfire from a different direction. Then there was the strange behavior of federal agents. Although the FBI had maintained constant surveillance of the leader for years, it claimed none of its agents were in the city that day. But eyewitnesses identified men they believed were federal agents at the scene. Records later showed that military intelligence units had been operating nearby, and that many of those records were destroyed shortly after the assassination. Despite the jury's verdict and the mounting evidence, no federal investigation was reopened. No new trial was granted. Officials insisted there was nothing more to examine. Why? Perhaps because admitting the truth would mean acknowledging that one of America's most iconic voices for peace and justice was silenced with the silent approval or active participation of those sworn to protect him. The assassination wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a moment when an entire movement lost its most powerful voice. And perhaps more chillingly, it revealed just how far institutions would go to preserve the status quo. We remember him for his dreams. But we must also remember how he died, and why so many were invested in making sure the full story was never told. The echoes of that silence are still with us today. Sometimes the most dangerous experiments are the ones no one knows are happening. From 1944 to 1974, the U.S. government conducted more than 4,000 radiation experiments on unsuspecting citizens. They were patients, prisoners, pregnant women, children, people who trusted the system and were betrayed by it. The justification? National security. The real motive? Data. Scientists wanted to understand how radiation affected the human body, how much it could withstand, how it moved through blood, how it passed to unborn children. But rather than study willing participants, they used deception and sometimes outright cruelty. At a state school in Massachusetts, mentally disabled children were fed radioactive oatmeal. They had joined what they thought was a science club. Their parents had signed vague consent forms. None mentioned radiation. The boys smiled for group photos, unaware they were part of a government-funded experiment. At a prestigious university hospital, doctors injected terminally ill patients with plutonium. These patients believed they were receiving care, not that they were being used as test subjects. Most were never told what had been done to them. Some died without ever learning the truth. In prisons, the experiments were even more invasive. In Oregon and Washington, inmates were paid small sums to have their testicles exposed to radiation. Scientists wanted to study sperm damage, possibly for future sterilization programs. Many of the men developed cancer. None were informed of the full risks. Pregnant women were also used. At a major university, 829 expectant mothers were given vitamin drinks secretly laced with radioactive iron. Researchers wanted to observe how radiation crossed the placenta. The women were told it was part of a nutritional study. Years later, many developed complications. So did their children. These were not isolated incidents. The experiments were widespread, coordinated, and funded at the highest levels. Some were overseen by the Atomic Energy Commission. Others involved the Department of Defense. In nearly every case, the subjects were chosen because they were poor, institutionalized, or otherwise unlikely to question authority. For decades, the truth was hidden. Research was published in medical journals, but the methods were sanitized. Classified stamps blocked access to key details. Consent forms were forged or destroyed. And the victims? Forgotten. In 1993, everything changed. A cabinet secretary ordered a comprehensive review of radiation experiments. Thousands of documents were declassified. A presidential advisory committee confirmed what had long been suspected. Thousands of people were exposed to radiation without informed consent. Many suffered. Some died. The report concluded that researchers had deliberately targeted vulnerable groups. Ethics had been abandoned in the name of progress. A formal apology was issued. Some victims received compensation, but most never saw justice. The most haunting aspect? These experiments happened at the same time the U.S. was prosecuting Nazi doctors for similar crimes. At Nuremberg, we condemned human experimentation without consent as a crime against humanity. Back home, we were doing the same thing, quietly, methodically, and with government approval. Radiation doesn't ask permission. It lingers in bones, in blood, in birth defects and cancer diagnoses decades later. The victims carried it with them, often without knowing why they suffered. History has a way of burying its darkest chapters, but the fallout remains. And in remembering these experiments, we're reminded of a fundamental truth. Science without ethics is just another form of violence. Between 1899 and 1902, a war unfolded thousands of miles from the American mainland, a war most Americans today have never heard of. It was the Philippine-American War, a brutal, bloody conflict in which the U.S. military sought to crush a fledgling independence movement. It was also a war defined by widespread atrocities, many of which were deliberately erased from public memory. It began with promises. After defeating Spain, the U.S. assured Filipinos that liberation was near. But when Filipino revolutionaries declared their independence, the American government refused to recognize it. What followed was not a liberation, it was an occupation. American soldiers were ordered to suppress resistance by any means necessary. Villages were burned, civilians were massacred. One general infamously commanded his troops to kill everyone over the age of 10 on the island of Samar, turning it into what he called a howling wilderness. Torture became routine. The most notorious method was the water cure, an early version of what we now call waterboarding. Prisoners were forced to ingest gallons of water, then beaten or stomped on until they vomited. The goal was to extract information. The result was often death. The military established concentration camps, euphemistically called reconcentration zones. Civilians were forced into overcrowded, unsanitary enclosures to separate them from insurgents. Disease and starvation ran rampant. By war's end, estimates of Filipino civilian deaths ranged from 200,000 to over 1 million. American soldiers documented the horrors in letters sent home. One wrote of burning entire towns. Another described executing wounded prisoners. These weren't isolated acts of brutality. They were systemic, encouraged, and protected by the chain of command. When news of the atrocities reached the U.S., there was initial outrage. Congressional hearings were held. A few officers were court-martialed, but most received minor punishments or were quietly retired. The general who ordered the Samar massacre, he was reprimanded but allowed to keep his pension. The real cover-up began afterward. History books downplayed the war, portraying it as a minor rebellion rather than a major colonial conquest. The death toll was minimized. The atrocities were either omitted or described as unfortunate exceptions. For generations, American students learned that the Philippines had been peacefully guided toward civilization. In reality, the Philippines had to fight for its freedom twice, once against Spain and once against the United States. The Second War was longer, more devastating, and more traumatic. The legacy of that war shaped American military tactics for decades. Techniques developed in the Philippines, counterinsurgency, reconcentration camps, psychological warfare, would later be used in Vietnam, Iraq, and beyond. But because the war was forgotten, those lessons were never publicly questioned. In the Philippines, the memory of the war remains vivid. Monuments honor the fallen. Stories are passed down through generations. But in the United States, it remains a historical blind spot. A war that was never truly reckoned with. To understand America's role in the world, we must remember this conflict, not as a footnote, but as a foundational moment. A moment when ideals of liberty and justice were abandoned in the pursuit of empire. A moment when silence became strategy and forgetting became policy. The Philippine-American War was not an accident. It was a deliberate campaign of domination. And until we confront it, we cannot claim to fully understand our history or the cost of the power we often take for granted. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, in cities across America, a new kind of revolution was quietly feeding children before school. It wasn't funded by the government nor organized by traditional charities. It was run by young activists who believed that no child should have to learn on an empty stomach. They called it the Free Breakfast for Children program. It was a radical idea, not because it was violent, but because it worked. In neighborhoods long abandoned by social safety nets, the program fed tens of thousands of children every day. Volunteers showed up before dawn to cook. Churches opened their kitchens. Local grocers donated food. There were no income checks, no bureaucracy, just hot meals and dignity. Teachers noticed the difference. Attendance improved. Kids were more alert. Communities rallied around the effort. For a brief moment, hope tasted like scrambled eggs and oatmeal. But in Washington, the program was viewed with suspicion, not because of what it was doing wrong, but because of what it was doing right. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover labeled it a national security threat. Not the guns, not the protests. the breakfasts. Internal memos revealed the Bureau's real fear, that the program was winning hearts and minds, that it proved a revolutionary organization could provide for its people better than the state. And so the FBI declared war, not on criminals, but on cereal and compassion. Agents called in fake health complaints to shut down kitchens. They raided churches mid-service, overturning tables and arresting volunteers. In some cities, reports emerged that food had been tampered with, possibly even poisoned, to discredit the program. Parents were visited by police and warned that sending their kids to eat free breakfast might make them targets. The message was clear: feed your child here and you might lose them. This wasn't just surveillance, it was sabotage. The FBI pressured suppliers to stop donating food. They spread rumors. They fabricated charges. They weaponized fear. And it worked. The constant raids, harassment, and logistical blockades drained the program's resources. Churches backed out. Volunteers burned out. The program began to shrink. By the mid-1970s, it had been largely dismantled. Years later, the federal government would quietly adopt the idea, rolling out its own school breakfast program, modeled directly on the one it had once tried to destroy. But no apology was issued. No reparations were made. The children who lost those meals and the communities that lost a source of pride and purpose were never acknowledged. The war on the free breakfast program wasn't about food. It was about control, about the fear that empowerment in the hands of ordinary people might challenge the status quo. It's easy to celebrate change after it's been sanitized, stamped, and repackaged by institutions. Much harder to remember that the first attempts were often crushed, not for failing, but for succeeding too well. So when we talk about feeding children today, we should remember those mornings in church basements, the clatter of dishes, the quiet defiance of volunteers who believed that justice could start with something as simple as a plate of eggs, and the government that decided even that was too dangerous to let live. History has a way of casting shadows that stretch into the present, and some of those shadows begin with silence, not just what's forgotten, but what was never allowed to be known. For decades, a simple truth has lingered behind classified walls. Governments don't always protect people. Sometimes they experiment on them. One of the most damning examples came not from a battlefield, but from a laboratory. In the 1950s and 60s, deep inside secure military bases, the U.S. conducted secret tests of biological and chemical weapons on American soil. The goal? To see how deadly agents would disperse in real cities. The subjects? Entire civilian populations who were never informed. In San Francisco, a naval ship sprayed a cloud of supposedly harmless bacteria into the air, blanketing the city in a microbial mist. The military monitored how the particles spread through homes, hospitals, and schools. Residents went about their days unaware they were breathing in an experiment. Soon after, a rare infection appeared at a local hospital. One man died. The military denied responsibility. In New York City, light bulbs filled with pathogens were shattered in subway tunnels during rush hour. The idea was to test how quickly an airborne agent could travel between boroughs. Thousands were exposed. No one was told. This wasn't isolated. Across the country, in St. Louis, in Washington, D.C., in small towns and major cities, the government released chemical compounds from rooftops, trains, and cars. Some tests used zinc-cadmium sulfide, a known carcinogen. Children played under skies dusted with invisible toxins. When the truth began to emerge in the 1970s, the government claimed the agents used were harmless, but follow-up studies revealed spikes in cancer and chronic illness in affected neighborhoods. Lawsuits were filed. Most were dismissed. Documents were incomplete, data missing, responsibility denied. Why did it happen? Because the Cold War demanded answers to terrible questions. How would a biological weapon spread in a subway? How quickly could a city be infected? How far could you go before someone noticed? The justification was always the same. national security. But the cost was borne by people who were never asked to participate, who never gave consent, who were treated as test subjects in experiments they never knew existed. The official narrative insists these programs were necessary, that no real harm was done. But the families who buried loved ones, the neighborhoods still grappling with unexplained illness, tell a different story. This chapter of history reminds us that secrecy is not always safety, that the institutions meant to shield us can, under the right pressure, turn us into data points in a spreadsheet no one ever intended to share. And it forces us to ask, if these experiments were hidden for decades, what else remains locked away? What truths are waiting to be told long after their consequences have been felt? In the end, the legacy of these tests is not just the physical harm they caused, it's the breach of trust. The knowledge that under the guise of protection, the government played a game of exposure, where the people were never told they were the ones at risk. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't through confession. It was through paperwork, misfiled, forgotten, until someone started asking the right questions. Truth, they say, is the first casualty of war, but sometimes the deeper casualty is memory itself. Between 1940 and 1970, the U.S. government quietly conducted experiments on American soldiers, experiments that exposed them to chemical weapons, psychoactive drugs, and even radiation, often without their knowledge or consent. These weren't battlefield risks. These were controlled tests, conducted in labs, training facilities, and even hospitals. The soldiers were told they were participating in routine studies or training exercises. They had no idea they were being used to study the limits of human endurance and the effects of untested substances. One common practice involved administering LSD to soldiers without warning to see how they reacted under pressure. Some were locked in rooms under surveillance, hallucinating for hours. Others were sent into field exercises while under the influence. The goal was to explore mind control, interrogation resistance, and chemical warfare tactics. Other tests focused on nerve agents and mustard gas. Soldiers were placed in sealed chambers and exposed to dangerous concentrations, sometimes while wearing faulty protective gear. In many cases, they were told they'd been given vaccines or harmless substances. Some suffered immediate reactions, burns, lung damage, neurological issues. Others developed cancers years later. Even after death, some service members were denied dignity. In select cases, the military retained organs for further study without notifying families. The body was returned. The truth was not. Documents show that the Pentagon was aware of the risks. Internal memos acknowledged the possibility of long-term health effects. Yet the experiments continued, often targeting those with limited education or means to resist, young recruits who trusted their commanders and followed orders. When these practices were exposed through declassified files and whistleblower accounts, the response was slow and muted. Official statements framed the tests as unfortunate but necessary steps in Cold War defense. Compensation was limited. Few officials were held accountable. Many veterans who experienced severe health complications were denied benefits, their symptoms dismissed as unrelated. A 2010 Presidential Bioethics Commission confirmed that non-consensual experimentation had occurred, but it offered no sweeping remedies, only the recommendation that future research follow ethical standards. For many victims, it was too little, too late. What sets these experiments apart is that they were conducted not on enemy prisoners or captured spies, but on the very people sworn to defend the country. Soldiers who believed they were serving something greater than themselves were used as tools in secret research, then cast aside when their usefulness expired. The tragedy lies not only in the physical harm, but in the betrayal. The bond between soldier and nation is built on trust. These experiments shattered that bond, replacing it with silence, denials, and redacted files. Today, most Americans remain unaware that their own government tested chemical weapons and experimental drugs on its troops. These stories are rarely taught in military history. They exist on the margins, in lawsuits, in forgotten warehouses, in the fading memories of those who lived through them. But remembering them matters, because if we can't acknowledge the ways in which power has been abused, even against our own, we risk repeating those violations in new forms. Ethics, once broken, are hard to restore, and for those who wore the uniform and returned home with questions no one wanted to answer, the wounds are not just physical, they're historical, they're national, and they're still waiting to heal. History, we like to believe, is a settled record, a collection of facts arranged in the right order, told by trusted voices. But as we've seen across these stories, hidden, erased, or quietly declassified, history is also a battlefield. Not just over what happened, but over who gets to decide what's remembered. We've walked through forgotten conspiracies, buried massacres, secret experiments, and betrayals dressed as policy. These weren't rumors. They weren't theories. They were real events, often admitted only after decades of denial. The pattern is consistent. Something terrible happens, someone profits or protects power, and the truth is buried under paperwork, threats, or silence. And yet, the truth still finds its way out. Not because systems are transparent, but because someone refuses to look away. A whistleblower keeps a file. A family refuses to forget. A journalist asks the wrong question at the right time. But even when these truths emerge, they often arrive too late. Too late for justice, too late for restitution, and too late for the victims whose lives were forever altered. We call them historical footnotes. But they were people with names, hopes, and futures stolen by forces they never saw coming. So what do we do with all this? What does it mean to live in a nation whose history includes not only triumph, but cover-ups? Where institutions that promise protection have at times operated in the shadows, targeting the voiceless, the vulnerable, even the patriotic? We ask questions, we stay curious, we recognize that silence can be a tool of power, that forgetting isn't always an accident, and that truth, once known, carries its own kind of justice, even if that justice arrives without a courtroom. This isn't about rewriting history. It's about completing it, expanding it, refusing to accept a version of the past that only flatters the powerful. If we want a better future, it begins with an honest past. The events we've explored don't define America, but they are a part of it. To ignore them is to pretend that systems are infallible, that mistakes aren't repeated, and that memory is optional. But memory is everything. It's how we learn, it's how we heal, and it's how we protect the next generation from the sins of the last. So we close not with an answer, but with an invitation to read between the lines, to question what's missing from the official narrative, and to hold space for the stories that were almost never told. Because the measure of a country isn't just in what it celebrates, it's in what it's willing to confront. And only by facing our forgotten history can we begin to write a future that doesn't leave anyone behind.